My great claim to fame is that I teach the U.S. presidency with this icon of Longwood, Bill Harbour, each fall. It was in our classroom, his classroom, I like to call it ours.
It's yours
occasionally. That the idea to put our name in the hat to potentially host the debate that we wound up hosting, it was in the classroom that idea germinated.
I was just teasing you. You took it serious.
And then my other claim to fame, which makes being here very sentimental and profound for me. Many of you know my mom, who's on the board of Poplar Forest, native Lynchburger, daughter of Lurleen and Everett Bond. So it's great to be here. For that reason too, Poplar Forest has had a cherished place in my heart all my life because of that. I think Jefferson, Mr. Jefferson, as we gather here in the dining room, really would be deeply intrigued to think about the vice presidency and how it has evolved over these 2 centuries. And in particular, he might be surprised, even pleasantly so, at the way that this office, which once upon a time did provide for philosophical nights in the winter and rural days in the summer, has become, in great measure, thanks to Mondale and things since 1976, really one of the most powerful offices in the entire United States, perhaps even often rightly conceived of as the second most powerful office in the United States, with the succession of Mondale to Bush Sr., even Dan Quayle, we might talk about it, fits in the paradigm. Certainly Gore, certainly Cheney, certainly Biden, and very likely to be the case that Tim Kaine or Mike Pence would continue with the modern tradition of the vice presidency. When Bill and I teach, as we were doing just yesterday afternoon, we tend to take a pretty Socratic approach. So don't feel shy about asking questions or answering questions. And I will now pass the baton to Bill to begin the march from the early days of the vice presidency to its modern glory.
Every time I come across a news article where some physicist is talking about the nature of the universe, I hear this idea that there's a multiverse, that there are different universes. I think the vice presidency is like that. Depending on what point of time you jump into in the history of the office, it's completely different. It is a different universe. We're more familiar right now with vice presidents who play such a central role in advising presidents in decision making. But for most vice presidents, it's been I don't want to be crude, but kind of a worthless job. In the 19th century, I think 6 of them died in office. And I was thinking today, I can't name any of them. I'm trying, but most of us just don't think of vice presidents in the 19th century.
Yeah, a remarkable thing in the 19th century, I think there are 25, 26 years during the 19th century when the office was simply vacant. And prior to the 25th Amendment, relatively recently, there was no mechanism to replace a deceased vice president.
That's right. And we do know from the letters and the humor and the sometimes bitter comments of earlier vice presidents that they often didn't think much of the office. I think some of us are familiar with the story of Daniel Webster, who was such an important leader in the country. He was offered the office, and he said he would not take it because he didn't want to be buried until he was dead. John Adams wrote to his wife that his countrymen had awarded him for all the years of faithful service to the country by giving him the most worthless office ever designed by man. And probably the best comment was by John Nance Garner, who once upon a time was Speaker of the House of Representatives, but he winds up serving 2 terms under Franklin Roosevelt. he commented that the office wasn't worth a picture of warm spit. I'm being polite. Frustration was great for so many of them. And, you know, some people were chosen as running mates at national conventions when the party leaders actually knew they had terminal diseases. In one case, a person died before he could even take office. In another case, a person died a few months afterwards. It's a very different world now. But think particularly about how unhappy some of them must have been. Think about Lyndon Johnson, the giant of the Senate, having to serve under John Kennedy, who was, in his view, a nothing playboy, who unfortunately beat him out for the Democratic nomination. He's humiliated in the office. He's telling his aides, it's all over, I'm through, there's nothing here. Constantly, behind his back and sometimes in front of his face, younger people who, the age of his children, making fun of him. What frustration, what unhappiness they must have experienced.
Yeah, with regards to LBJ, underscoring the extent to which he was incredibly cut out of the action. The Cuban Missile Crisis transpired completely without his input. He was not involved in those proceedings at all, which is just unfathomable when you think of the present day. Say put the picture of the strike on bin Laden in your mind's eye, and there's Joe Biden right in the heart of the situation.
Indeed, for some of those vice presidents, their frustration boiled over. For George Clinton, in his second run at being vice president, he publicly criticized the president. John C. Calhoun publicly criticized the president. John Nance Garner, in the last part of Roosevelt's second term, was publicly distancing himself from parts of the New Deal. He rejected Roosevelt's court packing plan and everything. And he wanted to be the Democratic nominee in 1940. What frustration.
So it conjures the question, why was the vice presidency created in the first place when the framers were gathered in the hot and steamy room in Philadelphia, dreaming of what the Republic could look like? Why have a vice presidency? And historians typically point to one principal reason, procedural, and one deeper reason of analogy. It's a little bit harder to trace, but the framers, in a way, it's difficult for us quite to inhabit the same mind that they did. They were incredibly knowledgeable of the ancient world, and they thought a great deal about democratic Athens and Republican Rome. Those of you who know a little bit of Roman history, you'll remember that there were always two consuls, a senior one and a junior one. So that template of an executive that's still somehow split or bifurcated vaguely was in their mind. But they also faced this procedural issue, which is not something we think about a great deal these days. What they worried about when the United States was still in people's philosophical mind's eye, much more like the EU is today, where people identified much more with Virginia or New York or Pennsylvania or South Carolina than they did with America, was that when votes were cast for president, it would simply be a litany of native sons from the different states, and that there wouldn't be any clear winner. By having the vice presidential mechanism set up the way they did, where the leading vote getter becomes president and the second vote getter becomes vice president, and you get to cast two votes. This is before the 12th Amendment changed some of these rules. It essentially allowed individuals to vote for a native son in South Carolina or Virginia or New York, but also vote for a national figure like a George Washington or a John Adams or a Thomas Jefferson to ensure that there was a national figure elected president. So the vice presidency was born basically out of this procedural necessity. And then that began to break down in the time of Jefferson, with the complicated scenario with the 1800 election, and Aaron Burr being tied with Jefferson, kicked to the House,
A rascal.
Which produced the procedural evolution of the 12th Amendment shortly thereafter, which ensured that presidential voting was by ticket, essentially, so that the vice president was no longer essentially the runner-up in the presidential election, but was elected by ticket. That, however, produced the long 19th century malaise for the vice presidency, where it was just a largely irrelevant figure, and not a consequential national figure with potentially national aspirations subsequently.
And we think of it today as the person who gets his party's nomination, or her party's nomination, getting to choose who they want as the running mate. But once you have the 12th Amendment and the recognition, democracies are going to have political parties. They didn't anticipate that. They feared that, and they immediately produced political parties. What happened was the selection process in the 19th century did not really involve the person who would be the presidential nominee in a basic way. At the national conventions that were choosing the ticket, party factions, party leaders would decide upon the presidential nominee, but they would also make the decision, not the nominee, they would make the decision from the standpoint of their interests, deals, bargaining. In the 19th century, many conventions went multiple ballots to even choose a presidential nominee. So party leaders had to find a way to bring the party together, reward various individuals. So you wind up with an administrative team, not a team as we think of it, but a president, therefore, representing certain things in his party, but you might have a vice president representing a different faction in the party. And that immediately created distance between the individuals. So you continue to have this issue of vice presidents being on a different wavelength. Arthur criticizing Garfield and things like that. But then it changed in 1940.
Which it begins to beg the question: how did we get to today? How did the vice presidency, unlike so many other offices and institutions in American government, actually begin to work better and become more consequential? And the story, I think, is really one of necessity on the one hand, and fortuna, as Machiavelli and Dr. Harbour would
I've infected you with Machiavelli.
Point out, just the force of events. So necessity first. 1940 is a good point of departure. National security all of a sudden is a daily, omnipresent concern in American life, beginning with the Second World War and forward to today. And that there's not the 19th century luxury, essentially, of being able to not worry about who is in charge of the ship on a day-to-day basis. So that there needs to be the ability for a clean handoff in the event of something horrible befalling a president. That's the necessity that begins to kick in. But then the hand of fate that begins to set the table for how things have procedurally evolved from the time of Mondale forward, is that starting, really with 1940 in a way, and accelerating 1944, things begin to change. So in 1940, FDR, breaking the pattern and running for a third term, has enormous sway over the Democratic Party, and he breaks another pattern, and he simply tells the party, convention, you are not going to choose who the vice president is. I am going to tell you who I want. dictates that the party accept Henry Wallace, who's much more liberal than many of the members of the convention, and probably would not have been chosen had FDR not essentially dictated. Then we get to 44 and 45, and FDR passes away in the midst of an acute, if trending towards success point in the Second World War. And there's the handoff to Truman, and Truman is automatically thrust into the crux of every international matter that you could conceive of. Automatically becomes arguably the most powerful person in the world. Then fast forward just slightly, and you get to Eisenhower and Nixon, and Eisenhower is much more accustomed than prior presidents to staff work and continuity of operations and the like. And so even though Nixon doesn't become a Gore or a Cheney-esque figure, he is still much closer to the action than vice presidents of yore. Then you get to JFK and LBJ, and fortune intercedes again. LBJ obviously becomes president in '63. Then Nixon himself is elected president in '68. So you have this succession of vice presidents becoming very important in American life. Nixon resigns the 25th Amendment after JFK's assassination because it's more evident that there really needs to be a vice president in place. Luckily, it was in place by the time of Watergate, so Nixon resigns with Agnew having already resigned in disgrace. And so, but for the 25th Amendment, there wouldn't have been Gerald Ford there to step in. So another vice president becomes president, and then you get to '76, and Carter, who had many troubles in his presidency, but there are wise things that history will probably reward him for. This being one of them, how he treated the vice presidency. He was very attuned to the fact that the vice presidency was becoming more consequential, and he wanted to figure out how to really institutionalize that. And so he was very deliberative in a way that prior presidential nominees had not been. Very deliberative in the process by which he chose Mondale, very deliberative in consulting with Mondale about how to make the vice presidency a much more consequential office. And they devised an array of things which today seem quite practical and obvious, but were not previously. The vice president didn't used to have an office in the West Wing. That's amazing in retrospect, but prior to Mondale, it was not the case. Vice president didn't used to have a standing weekly meeting with the president, and Carter and Mondale initiated the ritual and the habit of having that weekly lunch. We can all kind of imagine the pictures that we've seen of the weekly luncheons between the president and the vice president. Vice presidents didn't really have a staff before Mondale. By the end of the Carter administration, the vice president had a staff of about 60, and that, changing from a staff of just a handful or less. That's really endured subsequently. And the vice president didn't used to inhabit the Naval Observatory. There wasn't really that ceremonial home. Ceremony can be so important in life, and that changed with Mondale. Nelson Rockefeller, Ford's vice president, had done a lot with his personal means to make the Naval Observatory the grand place that it is now, but never actually lived in it. And so Mondale was the first to inhabit it. And the pattern has endured since. And today, and that succession kind of underscores it, Mondale, Bush, Quayle, Gore, Cheney, Biden. Today, it's an expected part of American life that a vice president will be a consequential figure. And I think in some ways, culture is still catching up to reality. So we still, those of you who watch Veep on HBO, it's very funny, but it's got an old style sensibility about the vice presidency as this inconsequential office occupied by buffoons, when that just hasn't been the case since 76.
And if you think back to John Adams' unhappiness with the office, he also wrote to his wife that while I'm nothing today, someday I might be something. And probably thinking maybe, as would happen, he would be elected president himself. But only 5 vice presidents have actually gone on to be elected president. And in one case, the vice president had to wait 8 years before that happened. 14 vice presidents have become president, but 9 got there because the president died. And while in the 19th century, the death of a president would be tragic and people would mourn it, and even in the early 20th century, people would mourn. When you think about Harry Truman and World War II and the subsequent Cold War and the nuclear battles of terror, suddenly presidential mortality becomes much more present in the minds of all the leaders in Washington and in the American public. Think of that generation from the 40s to the 60s that led up to the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment is not only about filling an empty vice presidency, which no one cared about in the 19th century because people didn't pay attention to the office, but also address the issue of presidential disability. If there's this Cold War going on and there's a nuclear battles of terror, what happens if the president isn't quite right up here? And you have the issue of illness, not just FDR's death, but Eisenhower's trips to the hospital with heart attack and other health issues, a little uncertainty there, and of course the Kennedy assassination and everything. So when you get the 25th Amendment, they're responding to the constitutional fact that the office is now more important, and we have to think about it. We have to think about disability. There have been even a popular novel in the late 50s, a bestseller, about a Night at Camp David, I think was the name of the book, and people worried, oh my, what if the president does something really crazy? And I think we see in this campaign some people suggesting that, maybe about one of the candidates and everything, but the 25th Amendment is the recognition on the part of our political system, and even in the states that ratified the amendment, that we have to take this office seriously and everything.
I sense a question beginning to percolate, but I will add another interesting connection with 76 that dovetails with what occurred at Longwood on October 4th, the great debate between Kane and Pence. 76 was the first time that there was a vice presidential debate, Dole and Mondale. And these debates are true today, true then. They're from a viewership standpoint, the only thing that is in their stratosphere are the Olympics and the Super Bowl, really. And so by having that debate in 76, Dole and Mondale, that also did a great deal to make the vice president-elect a national figure. And so it's interesting that we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the vice presidential debate this year as we see the office growing in stature through those years.
And one final thing about the presidential nominee of the party choosing the vice president. While Franklin Roosevelt started that, a number of presidents after him, the nominees of the convention, didn't take time to vet and do that much research on the background of the individuals. You think about Eisenhower in 52. He's nominated, there's 3 hours between the ballot for the presidential nominee and the vice presidential nominee, and in that 3-hour period, he gets his staff together and they figure, well, let's have a list, and Nixon Well, Hubert Humphrey in 1968. That's a disaster. He's fighting to get the nomination. There's a divided convention, and they have a 2-day period where they're talking about this, and without vetting much about Thomas Eagleton's background, he chooses Thomas Eagleton, and a few days later it comes out about his medical history. The ticket is embarrassed. Eagleton's off the ticket, and so immediately people are saying, well, what about the judgment of the Democratic nominee? Is he going to make other judgments like that in the future and everything? Or even Richard Nixon in 1972. There was no serious vetting of Spiro Agnew, and so it took a while. It took a while for the nominees to understand we got to take this new precedent we have seriously. And part of it is by political accident. After that, you start having more candidates in the long battle for the nomination, wrapping up the nomination long before the convention. And so that's giving them time, and it's to Carter's credit too. Not only does he give his vice president more authority, but he took the job of choosing a vice president seriously, and they had over a month to seriously investigate the possible candidates, look at the advantages and disadvantages and everything like that. And when we see that going on since that time, certainly there have been some foul-ups along the way. For John McCain, not enough maybe serious vetting of Sarah Palin and everything, but we see in most other cases, the potential nominee wrapping things up has taken the responsibility seriously because they're going to be judged by that choice, but they also know about presidential mortality, and they're still thinking about who's going to help me on the ticket and everything like that.
Wayne mentioned that in a prior incarnation, I had the great luck to work closely with Warren Christopher and Jim Baker, and Warren Christopher especially, but both trafficked in presidential politics and campaigning enormously. Christopher, in particular, was very involved in that vetting process for vice presidents in a number of campaigns, and he did have a lot of great war stories to tell. But those of you who have a sense of Warren Christopher's basic demeanor publicly, true also privately, very methodical and courtly, so the war stories never had very sharp edges to them. But it really was interesting to me then, interesting these days to reflect on it, how thorough that process really has become.
The classic example of Dick Cheney being in charge of choosing a vice president for George W. Bush. We know how that turned out. Maybe some questions.
Yeah, quite questions.
Yeah, I find that this fascinating that somehow people think that vice presidency has become more important because, I mean, I remember being told that I think Roosevelt had 4 different vice presidents, and he did that on purpose so that none of them would be particularly powerful. And then I think wasn't Alvin Barkley, was that the memorable vice president under Truman?
Yeah, it's true.
You know, you had people like that, and you had people like Spiro Agnew and Gerald Ford and Dan Quayle, and you know, you have your Dick Cheney there because somebody has to know about foreign policy, and they knew George Bush and the others. And you get these people, and even today, I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I never heard of Mike Pence.
Yeah.
And I've heard of Tim Kaine because I'm from Virginia, but I bet nobody in California. So you had people who were picked just so they wouldn't rock the boat. You know, nobody was going to pick Bernie Sanders or Jeb Bush or people like that. They're going to pick these nice people that are just kind of quiet. And they...
In some way...
And Joe Biden's the same way. I mean, you know, these are not people that...
The thing that's maybe different, increasingly, this isn't uniformly the case, but increasingly the presidential nominees over past decades are picking vice presidents more and more based on how they might be helpful in the governing process, and less based on how helpful they're going to be in the campaign itself. One of the things that political science maybe has divined over the last generation is that vice presidential nominees don't really have much effect on the campaign, and I I think that wisdom has begun to sink into their selection process. So they're being picked more for how helpful they can be as an advisor. And what really has changed structurally over the last generation is the access actually that they have to the president. Whereas Truman would go months literally without even speaking with Roosevelt, seeing him, being in the same room, meeting with him, anything. Vice presidents today are right there in the thick of the discussions.
I think about Harry Truman being informed there was a Manhattan Project. Joseph Stalin, because of espionage, knew about the Manhattan Project before Harry Truman, our vice president, became president. That's pretty scary when you think about it.
I just wonder, is there a clear-cut procedure for the case that a president is debilitated but not dead? For the vice president, I was thinking of Woodrow Wilson,
Yeah.
whose wife ran the country, and
Yeah.
who was his vice president? Or what?
Yeah, Thomas Marshall, who virtually never dealt
Sorry.
with Woodrow Wilson, and yeah, that would have been an example of where had the 25th Amendment been in effect. I guess the 25th Amendment was passed in 65, 66, thereabouts. Wilson would have probably, it's still a little bit of a gray area, but probably been in a fairly clear-cut disability situation, and the vice president, the 25th Amendment spells out the protocol, and the vice president would have succeeded the president. It's obviously never been used completely that way as of yet, though Reagan in particular, but subsequent presidents as well, when they've been getting general anesthesia for an operation, they will actually invoke the 25th Amendment should something happen to them.
Yeah, if the president knows he's not up to the job, he simply sends a letter to the principal officers of Congress telling them that. And then under the 25th Amendment, the vice president has a new title, acting president. And he has all the powers of the office until the president says, I'm okay now. More complicated part of the 25th Amendment, though, is sometimes when people are unable to do the job, they don't know it. What if you're in a coma? Or what if you're way out there? Way out there, people usually don't know it.
So I think I'm right about this. A great example of what Bill's mentioning is that I don't believe the 25th Amendment was invoked when Reagan was shot,
Right.
when he was clearly not capable of performing the job for at least a period.
When they should have used
When
it.
they should have used it, but when it was, at two instances, fairly routine surgery, but he was using general anesthesia, it wasn't public.
Yeah. But he, in sending the letter, said he did not want his situation to be a precedent for others who might be younger and it would not be necessary and everything. But when the president can't inform people or admit that he's unable, the principal officers of the government, the cabinet, the first time the cabinet has a real constitutional role, or if Congress established another body, presumably a psychologist, but they're not going to do that. If a majority of the cabinet decides the president cannot discharge the duties of the office, they send a letter to the principal officers of Congress, and then the vice president assumes the office until the president says, I'm okay now. If there's a dispute, to say the president is crazy and he says, I'm okay, all he has to do is send a letter and he gets the office back, but the cabinet can respond again. And then you have a dramatic situation. In a month's time, the Congress has to assemble, and they would have to find, the vice president is going to act as acting president during that time, but they would have to decide within about a month that the president was unable. They have to decide by a 2/3 vote to prevent it from getting the power back. So it is an attempt to solve a problem, but also prevent an alleged vice presidential cabinet coup d'etat or something like that. Yes.
Are there any vice presidential accomplishments besides stepping into the
Yeah,
office?
you see it much more in the last generation. Gore, you know, and it's always debatable how intense the accomplishments were, which is one of the things that makes it very complicated to run for president, having served as vice president, because what accomplishments do you have genuinely to your own name? But Gore was tasked with focusing on streamlining government. Cheney, you know, maybe most notably had, you know, at times early, especially in George W.'s administration, was thought to be the one really dictating foreign policy.
If you want to invade Iraq and call that an accomplishment, then Cheney would be an example.
Biden really was the prime negotiator for the Obama White House when the fiscal cliff situation was really at the precipice. But it's much more nuanced to talk about vice presidential accomplishments.
Eisenhower embarrassed Nixon in the 1960s when Eisenhower was asked at a news conference, because Nixon had all the advantage in terms of experience. Can you name accomplishments of Richard Nixon, your vice president? And Eisenhower said, give me a week, give me some time on that, I'll be back and everything. So, you know, a problem. One thing about to keep in mind on all this is, whether it's the cabinet or the vice president, presidents grant the access. If we had a president who wanted nothing to do with it, then the vice president would wind up like those people in the 19th century we can't remember and everything. Yes.
In the debate at Longwood, Governor Pence, in responding to a question about Russia and Syria, sort of answered the question in a way that put him, I think I'm remembering this right, put him at odds with what we understand to be Donald Trump's position. And that was, you know, something was made of that in the media. But now I hear that you were saying in the 19th century anyways, maybe that wasn't unusual, but in modern times, is that unusual where there's going to be dissension?
It's certainly something in modern times, that past 40 years, that there's been a concerted effort to smooth out those edges, though they still surface. Al Gore's thoughts about the Lewinsky situation would be a good example of that. George H.W. Bush's thoughts about economic matters were different from Reagan's, certainly during the campaign leading up to the 1980 election, and were kind of smoothed out over time. So there's an effort by the staffers and by the president, vice president these days to try to smooth those differences, but they really do still surface. I mean, another more recent example is Joe Biden was more outspoken about gay marriage than President Obama was initially. So it still happens, and perhaps happens beneath the surface even more so than it once did, because you really do have two, generally speaking, consequential figures in play, rather than a sun and a moon who's clearly not playing any role in the White House.
And since the presidential nominee plays a bigger role in choosing the running mate, as was the case in the 19th century, they're going to have a little more in common, as opposed to, I have to put up with this person because party bosses wanted and everything like that. From 1836, for the rest of the 19th century, no vice president was nominated by his party to become president. But in the 11 cases of vice presidents before Joe Biden, 9 went on to be nominated by their party at one point to be president. So it's now seen as a better chance to get a party's nomination. And that, I think, compels vice presidents to zip it. That if you are publicly betraying your president or speaking differently, the party is going to see that, hey, you're weakening our party, you're going after our person, everything like that. It would be intriguing, though, if Donald Trump got elected president, and you have Mike Pence, who we know on so many issues, trade, foreign policy, disagrees with Donald Trump. It would be interesting to the extent that Mike Pence would he make the calculation, someday I want to run for office and I can't divide the party, but on the other hand, I so strongly disagree and everything. One would anticipate that Senator Kane would have an easier way to accept disagreement with Hillary Clinton than Mike Pence would with Donald Trump.
Are you willing to speculate on what might be in Tim Kaine's head as to how he envisions what the job should be, what he would do in his job?
Yeah, it is interesting because he and Hillary Clinton, he and Bill Clinton too, they don't, as best I know, they didn't know each other particularly well beforehand. They obviously knew each other a little bit, but it's not a situation in which they've gotten to know each other really well. And should Hillary Clinton be elected, there will be there will be many issues of first impression historically. The first woman elected, but also the first spouse who happens to be a former president right there in the White House. And it's certainly possible that many of the advising roles that have informally been structured over the past 40 years could naturally be more in the hands of Bill Clinton than they would in the hands of Tim Kaine. I'd certainly expect that Tim Kaine hopes to inhabit a vice presidency that's in keeping with the Gore, Cheney, Biden, Mondale, Bush 41 model. I think that's why the prospect has so much appeal to him, but I think it's a little bit of an open question as to how exactly it will play out.
He'll have an opportunity. One would expect he'll have the office in the White House. Like recent vice presidents, he'll have access to the president's daily brief and all the national security documents and everything like that. But it's still it's the president's call in terms of what to do with it and everything.
You still think Pence being in the limelight helped him out? Because they mentioned him when Trump was in trouble that week back in 2020. Yeah, he doesn't even feel like the vice president yet. But you think if he just said governor, nobody knew, I mean, he would probably just been an animosity, not had that chance of being the party person in 2001. I mean, his name came everybody, as soon as Trump was in trouble, hey.
Oh, I think it certainly serves as a springboard to national recognition now. Though the cautionary tale there is no vice presidential nominee who has lost an election, been nominated for vice president and not become the vice president-elect, none other than Franklin Roosevelt has ever gone on to be elected president. But unambiguously, it turns somebody into a national figure.
I said it's amazing, all of a sudden his name just got thrown into the next year. We haven't had this election yet.
Yeah.
All of a sudden his name's being mentioned for 4 years, I think, also.
Yeah.
Just because he's the vice president, you pick with him. So.
There was a common observation after the vice presidential debate at Longwood that Mike Pence did a brilliant job helping himself, but didn't help Donald Trump one bit. And immediately many conservative Republicans started talking about 4 years down the road. If Trump loses, a lot will depend on how big does he lose and how do different factions of the party react as they blame each other. And it could well be he's simply caught in the middle. For the part of the party that blames Trump and is upset about all the things Trump has said, Pence's defense of Trump on many issues will come back to haunt him. And certainly, if the party loses big, people running against Pence 4 years down the road as Republicans, or a Democrat running against Pence, there's plenty of film out there about him praising Donald Trump. And particularly if Trump reacts in a way where he says the election is illegitimate and you have more division, or maybe even violence. I mean, you've got to confront that possibility. If that happens, Pence is toast.
Does Pence have any power base of any kind?
Any what?
Power base of any kind? Is he sort of a government?
Pence in inside baseball circles over the past 20 years, it has been thought of as a very serious figure, and while he was in Congress and as governor of Indiana, and he's quite well regarded in Congress, which I think is one of the reasons that Donald Trump thought that he would be a good pick.
He looks presidential, doesn't he? He's calm, particularly in contrast to the person he's running with and everything. If he has a power base, I think it would be in the religious right of the Republican Party. For that group, he is a hero because of his stance on issues in the past regarding gay marriage. He's been part of this movement on the part of some people on the right to propose in different states so-called religious freedom bills, which would allow in economic commerce discrimination against homosexuals based on your religious preferences and everything. Well, those people are committed to him, but he's had some controversial positions in the past that might hurt him in other parts of the party. He once very much supported gay conversion therapy, and for many people that's horrific. And he's a hero to some, but he's very much distrusted by others. So he does have a base there. But
There's a very patient question.
This is a follow-up to Kent's question, the other question about Tim Kaine. I'm sure you know, perhaps, who the other choices were of Hillary Clinton's, but why do you suppose she chose Tim Kaine?
I think for a number of reasons. He's developed a very strong record, mayor, lieutenant governor, senator, broad range of policy expertise. One of those rare figures in public life these days who has genuine friendships across the aisle and genuine working relationships. And in so many ways, he because of all those things, fits the model of the modern vice president as this senior advisor who can, in particular, work well with Congress. Then I think the fact that Tim Kaine is a Virginian played a real role as well. Virginia looks like it may be less of a swing state than was originally anticipated, maybe in part because Tim Kaine is on the ticket, but that I imagine played a real role too.
I think his Catholicism was also part of the picture, besides just being from Virginia and everything. A person of such deep faith and commitment to his religion. Democrats have often struggled with this, and certainly for a Clinton administration to have that voice, that outreach, that presence and everything is clearly a political attempt to balance the scales a little bit in that part of the population on the left and the right who, for faith matters, are important to kind of counter the Christian right among some evangelical Republicans and everything.
And the ability to engage with Congress has become a very important role for the vice presidency over the past generation. So many presidents now are outsiders. They're governors or have a fairly limited amount of Washington experience. And all of the vice presidents who've been so consequential in the past 40 years, I hadn't actually thought about this before, but they're all strong figures from a congressional standpoint. And the presidents of all, George Bush maybe being the quasi-exception of that role, but he was very much a Washington insider. All had the real ability to work with Congress in a strong way.
How Kaine's ability to be bilingual with the Hispanic population?
I think that was certainly probably a compelling reason too. Yeah.
We can also continue the conversation downstairs, but one final quiz for you. What vice president died 6 weeks into office and actually was brought, he was outside of the United States, but then was brought into the United States so he could die?
As I said, we don't remember a lot.
All right, okay. The suspense is enough.
Who is it?
And actually this ties into a wonderful artifact we have downstairs. It's a campaign pipe of Franklin Pierce. It was found in an archaeological excavation, and it's from the 1852, right? And actually then our archaeologists, our really crackerjack archaeologists, did some research, and I think it was Bell. Was it Bell his? No, not Bell. Anyway, his vice president died 6 weeks into office, and Pierce had no vice president for the remainder of his office. So just actually it was just an opportunity to tell you, make sure you take a look at that artifact downstairs.